Good morning, everyone. My name is Mario Machado. I'm the National Practice Leader of the OHS Department at Aon. Welcome to today's webinar on 45,001. So there's quite a lot of number of people dialing in today. There's about 300 people dialing in. So what we're looking to do, just some housekeeping, is if you've got any questions or comments, please put those into the panel on your screen. We won't be able to respond to them immediately, but we'll look at those, and then at the end of the session, we'll collate them, the more relevant questions, and then we'll respond to them. Alternatively, what we'll do is send a Q&A document afterwards if there's enough questions, and then we can answer all of your inquiries. So that's the housekeeping side of the webinar. So we'll move on to the general introductions and background. For those who don't know me, as I said, I'm Mario Machado. I'm the National Practice Leader of the OHS Department for Aon Australia, and as you can see, my experience and my interests lies in a range of things to do with work health and safety, and management systems is one of those things that we all get involved in. It's an essential part of work health and safety. So as a result, there's quite a lot of interest around this standard. I'm particularly interested in the relationship between culture and leadership in systems. We won't have time to cover a lot of that, but that's a bit of a segue into what we're covering today. Of course, today is really more about systems and the new global standard. So with that in mind, in terms of background, 45,001 and the term 45,001 has been thrown around quite a lot the last couple of years. If you think back to a few years ago, I was actually part of the technical committee for 4801, and a number of years ago, this is going back about 8 years ago, when we were going through the potential review of the standard, it was established that why would we want to update 4801 when globally there was a review of standards happening globally, which sort of brings us to where we are today, which is really around 45,001 being rolled out globally. It's a truly global OHS standard. It replaces 4801 in Australia. There were some delays with that, but globally, 45,001 was rolled out in March 2018, early this year. And the great thing about this standard is that it aligns with 9001 as well as 14,001, and which I'll elaborate a little bit more on in a minute. But this is a truly OHS standard, truly global OHS standard that really lifts the benchmark on OHS management systems and OHS management. The idea is that for companies that are certified, there'll be a 3-year migration period for those that are certified to 18,001, and companies that are certified to 4801. Gen Ants haven't actually agreed on the transition period, but my expectation is that that period will be more or less similar to the ones relating to 18,001. So I'm conscious that with so many people dialing in, that we've all got different levels of experience and interest, and as a result, it's important for us to just take a step back and ask ourselves, why is it that we're even talking about this, and why is 45,001 actually being published? And it simply comes back to this point, which is that despite everything that we've been doing for so many years now around work health and safety, globally, there's still a very high number of people that are injured at work, and there's still a very high fatality rate. So in many ways, we're very lucky in Australia because our legislation is well established, and we've got some very strong ways of how we culturally look at work health and safety, but we really need to think globally. How many countries globally in the world just are not as mature as we are? And the answer to that is that there's a lot. Hence the need for us to lift the bar on the benchmark of work health and safety globally, and hence the need for us to globally to all get on board with this particular standard, replacing 4801 and replacing 18,001. So in terms of the next 30 minutes, my plan is to cover a whole range of different things, from the strategic elements and the operational elements of the standard through to a number of key changes, and then delve into a bit more detail for those who might be looking for a bit more information on exactly what some of these changes look like. So the overall goals of the launch of 45001 was to define an OHS system structure which is aligned with that of others. So the spine and the structure of 45001 is built off the Annex SL guidelines, which essentially defines within ISO that any management system standards, whether they're quality, food safety, environment, etc., the spine behind them all are all the same. So there's, in addition to there being a consistent language in the global platform for 45001, there's a much better or a much increased compatibility and integration of systems along with quality, environment, and then safety. So if you're an organisation which is certified against those, it's a lot easier to integrate all of your systems. Some of the key changes that we're going to be focusing on include those relating to risk-based thinking, which is not necessarily new to Australia, but I'll still cover that because it gives you global context. Leadership, I'll cover a little bit on planning in terms of what some of the subtle changes are. Management of change and outsourcing. We'll also talk a little bit about some of the key changes around, not so much changes, but some subtle introductions around consultation and participation, which are a little bit unique and I think bear some relevance to what we're all trying to do. The benefits to us really is that irrespective of whether you're a global company or not, this standard provides us with global standardisation. So whether if you're a business that operates in Australia as well as overseas, we're all working off the same platform in terms of standards. So if you're a global company that was previously certified to 18001 and 4801, you only need now to be certified against one standard, and that really simplifies things. I think the most other important benefit with the standard really comes down to the fact that this gives us something different to talk to the business, well, to our business partners about. It allows us to introduce new concepts, and it allows another conversation around health and safety, which I think is a good thing. So if we go into a bit more detail in terms of the structure, the slide that you can see now shows you structurally the differences between 4801, 18001, and now the new standard 45001. And you can see from, we're all accustomed to the structure of 401 that starts with OHS policy and commitment, planning, implementation, measurement, evaluation, and management review. And that really applies more or less the same to 18001. And you can see from the table on the far left that 45001 in terms of structure is a little bit different. The changes are not significant in terms of the detail behind it, but as you'll see in a minute as we go into some of the detail, there's a lot more richness in the content of the standard. There's a lot more explicit requirements, and there's a further element that is more of a strategic nature rather than operational. So when you look at that standard there, you'll see, or that structure there, I should say, context of the organisation, leadership, performance evaluation to an extent, and improvement. They're all strategic elements that that the standard is calling for. It's not simply around, when we talk about health and safety in the systems, it's not just about focusing on risk management and incident reporting and incident management. There's a lot more to it, which has more of a strategic nature too. So with that in mind, 45001 is being built around the concept of PDCA, which is a continuous improvement concept. And essentially, this concept requires us to sort of think about, and not just around health and safety, but with anything that we do, the first step is to plan what you need to do. So from an OHS perspective, or in terms of 45001, the idea is that we understand what our legal requirements are. You understand what your risks and your hazards are, And with that in mind, you then go ahead and you develop your objectives and targets and your plans accordingly. And then, so that's your P for planning. And then the do is really around implementing what you set out to plan for and the processes behind it. So a lot of the nuts and bolts of work health and safety sit within D, which in the new standard is support and operation. And then check, which is the next step in the cycle, is really about checking that what we said we were going to do, is it working? What are some of the inputs and outputs that give us information about whether things are going as we wanted? And then improvement, or A for acts, is really around, how do we enforce the continuous improvement? But you'll see within that diagram that there's a number of other elements up the top: context of the organisation. These are all new things to 45,001 around internal and external issues and needs and expectations of interested parties. And they're really the strategic elements of the new standard. And it's really asking us to think about the big picture, not just sort of delve into the detail. And I've got some examples of that as we go into the next slide. So this slide here really delineates the differences between the strategic elements of the standard and the operational. So up the top there, context analysis, which is part of the context of the organisation, is really designed around us understanding the external and internal inputs and developments. So, and just to give you a bit of an idea of why this is quite relevant, I'm working with a mine at the moment in a remote part of Australia. This particular mine is the only source of employment in this particular location. So every single person that lives in that town either works at the mine or is related to someone that works in the mine. So in that context, this new standard is saying we really need to think strategically around, whilst as an employer we're only responsible for this, for managing the health and safety of our employees, but are there any external things that we need to think about? What's the context behind this? Through to other areas of the standard that talk about the management system, the leadership, the policy, the management review. So these are all things that one I'll cover off in a minute in more detail, but these are strategic parts of the standard, supported by the operational controls and measures, which are all the sort of more the nuts and bolts part of what we call work health and safety, around understanding the risks and opportunities and the actions that support that, and developing objectives and planning, through to actually doing what we said we were going to do. So that a lot more of the risk analysis and making sure that we're eliminating risks where we can, doing the performance evaluation and corrective action. So they're more at an operational level. That's what the standard calls for, and at a strategic level, it's more the context, understanding the context of the business, underpinned by the leadership and the structural elements of leadership, which I'll elaborate. So at this point, you might be wondering, what are some of the underpinning new requirements? But before we get to that point, you can see from this slide here, in terms of the structure of 45,001 would overlay it with the PDCA cycle. You'll see that there's a number of elements. So starting with context of the organisation, through to leadership, planning, support, and the like, and the sections underneath essentially give you an idea of the very specific criteria that underpins these elements, which are all based on the overriding structure of the PDCA. So I don't intend on going into a lot of detail at the moment, but this gives you a high-level overview of the very specific elements of the standard, and then the criteria sitting underneath it. So we'll cover some of these off in a moment in terms of the very specificness, because you might be actually wondering, okay, which are the key changes that are relevant to me in my business. So some of the key changes, and I won't be delving into an enormous amount of detail, but I'll be covering off some of the high level overviews. The first change is really around this risk-based thinking. This isn't necessarily new to us in Australia, because we've had performance-based OHS regulations for a long time. So our laws in Australia are underpinned by the employer or the PCBU to understand what risks they face, and then having to demonstrate that, or actually dealing with those risks and closing out risks, eliminating risks where they can. But globally, the concept of risk-based thinking is not necessarily something that every organisation is accustomed to. So this particular change or the concept of introducing risk-based thinking, if you work for a global company, might be something that will introduce some change across your business. And this is relatively new to 18001, not so new to 4801, but it's an important sort of change. It's an important subtle change in the way we're looking at work health and safety. Probably the other key thing that's new to the standard, in particular from a practical sense, is that the standard isn't just talking about risk, it's talking about risk and opportunities. So the idea behind this is that we don't want to just focus on the risks that we feel present the greatest risk to the business. We also want to identify where there's some opportunities for improvement that may not necessarily represent the biggest risk, but we can actually improve health and safety in the workplace. The language in the standard is being broadened to include that. So in other words, the standard is saying, think more broadly around risk. One of the subtle differences that you'll find with 45,001 compared to all the others, 401 and 18,001, is that there's a lot more definitions. So workplaces have been defined. The definition around workers is a lot more elaborate. So there's a lot there, and some of these definitions and terms are more relevant than others, and one that I think is quite important is the one around participation consultation. And I'll elaborate on this in a minute when we get to some of the detail, but the standard is essentially requiring us to think quite broadly in terms of the requirements on us to consult and participate with employees when it comes to health and safety, and to ensure that we've got systems in place for consultation and participation. And when we think about, well, what's the definition of both of those? We're well accustomed to consultation, which includes seeking views from others before making a decision. Participation is involvement in making decisions. And in workplaces that have got a legacy of the past in terms of potential industrial issues, this new concept may be one which is a bit more complex to implement locally. So there's a lot more richness and explicit detail in the standard across definitions, and these are just some of the ones that I've picked out as being important, and the ones that you might want to focus on to begin with. You'll also see that the standard uses some different verbs in terms of what you're required to do. So you'll see the words shall, which indicates a requirement, and shoulds, which indicates a recommendation, and there's a few others as well in terms of may and can, and they're more about looking at, they're not things that necessarily you need to do as a requirement, but they're possibilities, they're things that you need to explore. So obviously this is more important if you're certified. If you're certified against the standard, then the auditor, when it comes through, will be looking for evidence of these things, and you want to demonstrate that you're complying. But look at the subtle differences in the language that's used across the standard, as they will give you an idea of what's actually a requirement versus things that maybe you should consider but are not necessarily essential. So I've provided a bit of an overview and a high-level analysis of some of the key changes, but obviously I haven't gone into a lot of detail. And my intention is, over the next probably quarter of an hour or so, is to perhaps delve into a bit more detail. Detail section by section. So I'll highlight the ones that are perhaps new entirely, and those that have got sort of more material impacts, and then the ones that I think are worthwhile discussing in a bit more detail. So the first element of the standard is context of the organisation. As I said earlier, that's quite a strategic change to the standard. And the idea behind this, so both 4.1 and 4.2, they're quite new to us. So they're new to 45001 and not a requirement of 401. The idea behind this is really, before you push forward on implementing a safety system, think about the context of the organisation. Think about the needs and expectations of workers and other interested parties. So these interested parties might be neighbouring properties, it might be neighbouring organisations, it might be companies that you work with, it might be companies that you outsource products to, it might be a whole range of these sort of things. It may actually be the community. Using that example that I just discussed, where a mine that is the main source of employment in a small town, all of a sudden when you think about the big picture and you think about, well, what are we trying to achieve in terms of health and safety? When you ask yourself, what are the expectations of our community in terms of health and safety in our particular workplace, it may actually broaden your perspective on what you're trying to do as a business in terms of work health and safety. And then once you've got an answer to those 2 points, then the outcomes to 4.3, 4.4 naturally come out as a result. These aren't necessarily new to the business, new to the standard, but the standard provides a lot more information, a lot more explicit detail around these requirements. So that's the context of the organisation. As we lead into section 5, you'll see a couple of graded out areas there. 5.1 includes leadership and commitment. So in terms of leadership, I think this probably presents as the biggest opportunity for us all as safety practitioners, safety managers, and the importance of the inclusion of leadership in the standard is really, the desire here is to get us to think broadly in terms of not just commitment, but top management demonstrating leadership across the business with regards to work health and safety. So these are new requirements in terms of the leadership, and if you've got the standard in front of you, you'll see that there's a lot more richness in the criteria. There's a lot of detail around these things, the definition of leadership. So as you prepare to implement these new changes, our challenge is, how do we demonstrate that we comply with this particular criteria? What are the things that we need to do differently in understanding that the standard calls for, some of the definitions around leadership and what's expected from top management, and things like directing and supporting persons to contribute to the effectiveness of the system, ensuring and promoting continual improvement, as well as the culture in the organisation that supports the outcomes of the OHS system. So there's a whole range of things in here that we need to think about in terms of leadership, and I think this offers probably the biggest opportunity in terms of the standard, because as I alluded earlier, I've got a keen interest in leadership and culture and systems, and this is a perfect example of that, whereby this new standard is saying, well, having an OHS policy on the wall, which is 5.2 alone, is not enough. We really need to demonstrate leadership and commitment through a number of channels to ensure that we're compliant with this standard. But irrespective of whether you're certified or not, the idea behind this makes sense, and it's an important change. The other graded out area there is 5.4, which, as I alluded earlier, really expands on what we're all accustomed to in terms of consultation. The standard is also, it's included participation of workers. So the standard states that the organisation shall establish, implement, maintain process of consultation and participation. So in Australia, of course, there's a range of regulatory requirements around consultation with workers and employees, depending on which jurisdiction you're in. So this is not necessarily new to us, but the whole concept of participation may broaden the way you're doing things currently. And the logic here and the theory and the science behind this is that we know that if you engage with people early on and you get them involved, then you're more likely to get a good outcome. So that's what's driving these changes. But if your organisation or the workplace that you're in has, for example, potentially a militant workforce or a legacy of industrial issues, perhaps this could actually introduce some risk into the business. So you need to consider, how does this participation change in the standard impact on my business, and how do we demonstrate that we comply with it? So again, these are some of the more strategic elements of the standard. But as we move into 6, you'll see that there's a couple of not significantly new inclusions to the standard, but certainly there's a lot more detail around what's expected in terms of planning. And you'll see that the word opportunity has been included into the hazard ID and assessment criteria 6.1.2. And the idea behind this is just to it's to promote us being positive around how we look at risk, not just focusing on the ones that are the highest risk, but if you see an opportunity to address something which could reduce risk or prevent an injury, then we ought to be focusing on that. So this is a new change to the wording in the standard. And you'll see also 6.1.4, there's some partial new requirements that I don't think necessarily change the way, if you're certified against 401, this shouldn't really change the way you do things, but there's a lot more detail associated with that whole element, which is worthwhile looking into further depending on how you set up your systems and your processes internally. Section 7, as I alluded to earlier, in terms of the structure of the system, the word support is quite different, but in essence, the detail sitting behind it is more or less the same as what's in 401. There's a lot more detail behind it, but the fundamentals are all the same. This element just talks about ensuring they've got the appropriate level of resources, ensuring that people are trained and competent, having systems to support that, systems to ensure that communication internally and externally are in place, and then ensuring that you've got a system in place for managing documentation. That's the creating and updating and the control of documented information. So, whilst this looks different from the outset, the detail sitting behind it isn't really overly different to what we're all accustomed to if you're familiar with 401. When we delve into the operation element, you'll see that I've articulated here that there's a number of changes, and this is probably the area where I think there's more detail and potentially some things that we'll need to think about, particularly when I move on to the procurement side of things. But 8.1.2, which is within the 8.1 section there, offers a lot more detail around the organisation, ensuring that processes are in place for elimination of hazards, including the hierarchy controls. Again, this isn't new. Hierarchy controls has been covered off in 401 and 18,001, but the whole concept of focusing on elimination, I think, is one that's a lot more explicit in this new standard. But I think the areas that probably offer the biggest amount of change are those highlighted in grey there: management of change, contractors and outsourcing. And, again, whilst management of change is new to 45,001, 401 had elements of change in there, but it didn't have a whole section on it. And 45,001 does. It has a lot more detail around what's expected in terms of change management. And it's saying that the organisation shall establish processes for ensuring that permanent and temporary changes that have the potential to impact on health and safety, that they're managed appropriately. If you're a self-insured business and you're part of the NAT audit tool, this is not necessarily new, but again, to 401, this is something that that does offer a bit more detail. But the element around procurement is probably the area that offers some change to the way we're looking at health and safety. And really this has been designed around the fact that if you consider 401 was last published in 2001, 45,001 of these changes reflect how businesses are run nowadays. So the fact that organisations regularly outsource activities and engage contractors is a big part of health and safety nowadays, and this standard tries to capture that. Contractor management is not necessarily new, but you'll see that 45,001 has a lot more detail around it. But outsourcing, 8.1.4.3 is a whole new section that hasn't been included in either 18,001 or 4801. And this is one where the requirements for us to consider work health and safety extends well beyond the borders of your own organisation. So if you outsource parts of your products, let's say, to a third party, this standard is saying that the organisation has to ensure that there's processes in place associated with outsourced functions and that these processes are controlled. So, for example, a client that I'm working with at the moment is a food manufacturer. They manufacture butter, and they outsource a couple of their products to a co-packaging third-party business, which essentially packages their product. And essentially, what this standard is saying is that we have to be mindful that where we do outsource functions, that these things are controlled. We can't just, depending on the degree that we can apply, we have to consider these things. We have to ensure that outsourced functions are controlled. The extent to which you do that, I think, comes down to the overall context of how we've designed the system, but this is really one that I think offers some opportunities. Look, and I don't think it's a bad thing if you think about it. If the overall commitment that we're making to work health and safety is that we don't want anyone to get hurt, why should that be restricted to our own workplace? If we've got a relationship with a third party that we're asking to do something on our behalf in terms of a product, then we ought to ensure that those partners of ours that we're outsourcing things to are also doing, that are managing safety in line with our expectations. So I think that's probably one of the key changes to the standard, and it's one that I haven't seen a whole lot of dialogue around, conversations around, but it's one that I highlighted as something important. Performance evaluation, again, it's sort of no different to 4801, and although you'll see that there's a big section of the standard, the slide, which is highlighted in grey, these aren't necessarily new things, but they just offer a lot more detail. So these elements and criteria in the standard are a lot more explicit in terms of what we're required to do. So again, nothing new, but there's some partial new requirements associated with just a more explicit detail with the criteria. And you'll see the management review there. As I said earlier, we're accustomed to, with 4801, management review being at the back end. And as we've learned, management review is not at the end now, because we've got improvement. The improvement essentially is the back end of the system. And you'll see there that I've stated that continual improvement, section 10.3, is new to us. And it doesn't go into an enormous amount of detail, but the idea behind this is that organisations focus heavily on continuous improvement to ensure the suitability, adequacy, and the effectiveness of the OHS management system. So ensuring that we're enhancing health and safety performance and in promoting a culture that supports the system, and that all the objectives set out in the structure of the system have been addressed. And where there's opportunities for improvement, which is often the case, then you continuously focus on those and you build those into your planning for the next cycle. So that's some of the details sitting behind all of the changes with 45,001. So really the next steps come down to, what do we do next? And the opportunities here lie in, the first step is really doing a review of the system. So if you've got a system currently and you're certified or you're not certified, the first step is really just to do a gap analysis and work out, okay, how do we currently sit against the standard? Even though there's a few new changes, what about all the additional detail and how does that relate to us? Modify the systems and tweak them to ensure that you're compliant with 45001. Even if you're not actually certified, this is best practice and you should be working to it. And then you start training people. You start training your frontline leaders and your top management on these new requirements, and then basically implement those changes and you review them. So that's in essence what the next steps look like. I mean, obviously I've oversimplified that back end, but there's a really good opportunity for us over the next couple of years to evolve the way we're managing health and safety so that we comply with these new changes. So, as I said earlier, we've been monitoring questions that a few people have put forward, because a lot of these questions relate to some of the things that we've already spoken about. I always get questions around the outsourcing and what the difference is between outsourcing and contractors. And there's a little bit of overlapping, but essentially outsourcing is when you're engaging a third party to do something that ordinarily you do. So you hand over full control. It's not necessarily done in your premises, although it can be. And as opposed to a contractor, you're engaging your contractor to do something that is of they're essentially doing something that you don't have the capability to do, as opposed to an outsourcing arrangement where, using the example that I offered before, it can be a short-term or a long-term one-off appointment where they actually manufacture a co-package something for you. So they're the subtleties, but I think that there are particularly around construction where, with regards to, for example, the engagement of a principal contractor to do work, that's in essence an outsourcing as well as the engagement of a contractor. So they're the subtleties. I'm obviously not going into an enormous amount of detail, but that's it. The other question I've been getting a lot is around participation and what does that mean? And as I said earlier, in terms of the differences between participation and consultation, is that participation involves a lot more in terms of making decisions, and as opposed to just being consulted on potential decisions. So that has a little bit of risk to the way things have been done before. And as I alluded earlier, it's one that you need to have a closer look at, and that will vary from one organisation to another. But the underlying principles are that if you involve people in making change, then you're more likely to get some good positive outcomes, but it needs to be managed. And then there's a question around leadership and explaining in a bit more detail what that could look like. And we don't actually know how the leadership provisions in this standard will be applied, but the standard is calling for us to not just focus on having a policy up on the wall. It's really about how do we prepare top management for being able to demonstrate leadership. So in my opinion, it's really looking at linking that with the training side of the system and ensuring that we're training the organisation on complying with that part of the standard. So if we have a requirement on top management demonstrating leadership, how do we prepare them for it? So that we're leading by example, so that top management are leading by example, and they're priming the organisation for doing what we need to do in terms of the work health and safety. So they're probably the three sort of common questions that we've been getting in terms of the webinar, and this really brings us to the end of the webinar. Obviously, I've covered off a lot of detail in a short period of time, but I hope that I've been able to give you a good high-level overview of of what this new standard offers in terms of detail, in terms of expectations. In terms of the next steps, what we'll do is we'll send you a recording of the webinar so that you can come back and refer to this. We'll actually also give you a copy of the slides as well as a quick survey. So if you can give us some feedback, if you have a need for us to do more in terms of either webinars or training, please let us know. But I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope this adds value to what you're trying to do as a business. So in that regard, thank you very much for attending, and we'll talk soon. Thank you.